The bank lobby was crowded, voices echoing as people shifted impatiently in line. Harlan West stepped inside his clothes-worn frayed leather wallet gripped in his hand. He paused to hold the door for Elaine Mercer, who balanced a baby on her hip, but Trevor Sloan slipped past without a word, smirking at the sight of the old man. From his glass office, Clive Morrow spotted Harlan and strolled out, his polished shoes tapping against the marble. His lips curled into a mocking smile as his gaze swept over the faded shirt and torn jeans. Then, loud enough for the whole room to hear, Clive laughed. "If you even have a balance, old man, I'll pay you double." The words cracked through the air, sharp and humiliating. Heads turned. Conversations froze. A ripple of laughter rolled through the lobby, strangers staring at Harlan as if he were a joke. He lowered his gaze, silent, but his presence grew heavier than the laughter itself. What will happen when the truth no one expects finally comes to light? Years earlier, Harlan stood outside the same bank, his shirt damp with sweat sleeves rolled up from a day of hard labor. His hands clutched a folder of forms, the edges creased from use. Through the glass door, he asked for a small loan, just enough to build something of his own. The young clerk barely glanced at the papers before shaking his head. With a practiced motion, the door was shut, leaving Harlan staring at the bold letters of the bank's name above. His eyes burned with the weight of rejection, a sting deeper than words. A single bead of sweat slid down his sun-browned face, cutting a line across his cheek. From inside came muffled laughter, careless voices celebrating business that wasn't his. Harlan turned away, his shadow stretching long on the pavement. The bitterness of that moment carved itself into him not as defeat, but as a wound that would never be forgotten. In the present, Harlan walked slowly along the busy street, his steps steady but unremarkable. A wooden cart ahead tipped sideways apples scattering across the concrete. The vendor, a tired man, scrambled to gather them, his voice hoarse from pleading for help. People passed without pause, eyes fixed on their phones, their pace unbroken. Harlan knelt without hesitation, picking up each apple, brushing the dirt with his rough hands. His knees pressed against the ground, his faded clothes collecting dust, but he worked calmly, almost reverently. The vendor's eyes softened gratitude, spilling into a quiet thank you. Harlan answered with a nod, a fleeting smile, and rose to his feet. Around him, the city's noise drowned the small act, no one noticing, no one caring. Yet the gesture lingered like a seed planted in silence. As Harlan moved on, his figure seemed smaller against the crowd, but his quiet kindness spoke louder than the indifference surrounding him. Behind glass walls, Clive Morrow leaned back in his leather chair, the phone pressed to his ear. His laughter rang sharp as he boasted of profits, his voice filled with polished confidence. On his wrist, a Rolex glimmered each time he gestured, catching the sunlight in calculated flashes. An assistant entered with a folder, papers slightly out of order. Clive snatched it, eyes narrowing, and dismissed the worker with a cold rebuke. He adjusted his tie, turning to the mirror mounted on the office wall, admiring his own reflection. His smirk widened as he smoothed his suit, the picture of self-approval. On his desk, the keys to a bright red sports car lay gleaming, casually displayed as if they were trophies. The room exuded control power and vanity, each detail polished to perfection. While Harlan carried silence and humility, Clive surrounded himself with symbols of dominance. Their worlds were built on opposite truths, and sooner or later those truths would collide. At the counter, Dustin Hale leaned close to Marla Keene, his tone low but laced with ridicule. "You see the ones who dress like beggars? Always wasting our time," he whispered, lips curling into a smirk. Marla laughed, covering her mouth as if to soften the cruelty, but her eyes gleamed with agreement. A few feet away, Trevor Sloan lifted his phone, filming their exchange with sly amusement, his finger hovering over the screen to capture every mocking gesture. The shrill tone of a ringtone suddenly split the air, sharp and invasive, drawing frowns from the waiting crowd. Yet no one moved, no one cared. Conversations picked up again, the rhythm of indifference swallowing the moment whole. Customers shuffled papers, stared at screens, and tapped their shoes, blind to the quiet disrespect unfolding in plain sight. The culture of the room carried no empathy, no pause for dignity, only a cold efficiency mixed with shallow laughter. And in that small crack of carelessness, an unseen fracture grew wider. Elaine Mercer shifted uneasily, her baby fussing against her shoulder, small cries rising above the murmur of the lobby. The seats along the wall remained occupied, eyes glued to screens, no one lifting a glance. Harlan West rose slowly from his place in line, offering his seat with a gentle motion. Elaine blinked, surprised by the gesture, then murmured a soft, "Thank you" relief in her voice. Harlan's smile was brief quiet as he returned to his place, standing tall. Across the room, Clive Morrow caught the scene and let out a short, derisive laugh, muttering about pretending to be noble. Trevor Sloane angled his phone again, whispering with mockery, "Look at the old man putting on a show." The act of kindness, so small yet genuine, was met with sneers rather than respect. But in Elaine's eyes lingered a glimmer of gratitude, a contrast to the disdain around her. Kindness seemed out of place here, like a fragile light surrounded by shadows. Could such light endure when everyone else chose to look away? Long before this day, Harlan bent over rough wooden planks, hammer in hand, building a small stand on the side of a dirt road. His shirt clung to his back, sweat marking the effort of each strike. Friends passed by, shaking their heads, chuckling at the sight of him struggling with splinters and nails. You'll never make anything of this one called the words sharp meant to sting. Yet Harlan only smiled faintly, brushing the sawdust from his brow, and carried on with patient rhythm. At night, he sat under a dim lamp, counting coins into neat stacks, writing carefully in a tattered ledger, as though each number mattered more than its size. His hands, scarred and rough, moved with a steady purpose. A neighbor leaned over the fence, smirking, "Dreams are wasted on men like you." Still, Harlan did not answer. His silence was not surrender, but determination. Every coin placed in that ledger was a promise to himself. Clive Morrow emerged from his office, tugging at the cuffs of his tailored vest as if the gesture itself confirmed his authority. His eyes swept across the lobby, pausing when they landed on Harlan West, waiting quietly in line. Clive's brows furrowed, and he leaned toward Dustin Hale with a sneer. Dustin responded with a loud laugh, stretching his arms in an exaggerated yawn as though the sight of Harlan bored him beyond words. Clive's voice cut through the hum of conversation, pitched just enough to sting men like that don't belong here. The words hung heavy sharp in their dismissal, drawing glances from those nearby. Marla Keene, catching Clive's tone, gave a small approving nod, lips pressed together in silent agreement. The scene carried no disguised judgment, laid bare prejudice, worn proudly. Harlan remained still, his weathered hands folded over the worn leather of his wallet. He said nothing, but silence often speaks louder than scorn. Trevor Sloane lifted his phone, tilting it until the camera caught Harlan standing patiently in line. A grin spread across his face as he typed the title, "Old Man Waiting to Withdraw Pocket Change." With a tap, the stream went live. Notifications lit the screen, comments flooding in almost instantly, laughing emojis, jabs at the man's clothes, insults wrapped in mockery. Trevor turned the phone toward Dustin, who chuckled loudly, clapping his hand on Trevor's shoulder as though the ridicule were a shared game. Together they watched the numbers climb, feeding on the attention. Around them, the hum of the bank continued untouched by the cruelty now broadcast for strangers to consume. Harlan shifted slightly, the sound reaching him, but his face betrayed nothing. His silence wasn't ignorance, it was a kind of endurance practiced over years. The laughter swelled in pixels and whispers, but dignity remained intact. In a quiet room, lit by a single lamp, Harlan sat with a sheet of paper laid neatly before him. His hand, lined with age, trembled slightly as he wrote his will in careful strokes. Each word was simple, free of ornament, but carried weight. The wealth he had gathered through decades of struggle would not be left to indulgence, but to a scholarship fund, a gift for children who began with nothing as he once had. When the ink dried, he folded the paper with reverence, sliding it into the drawer of an old wooden cabinet. On the desk, a framed photo of his late wife smiled faintly back at him. Harlan lingered, fingers brushing the frame, his eyes soft with sorrow and quiet resolve. A faint smile touched his lips, filled with both memory and promise. He whispered to himself, steady as a vow, "I'll help those who were like me." Dustin Hale accepted Harlan West's paperwork with a scowl, his eyes narrowing as he traced the letters with exaggerated disdain. "What is this chicken scratch?" "Write it again, clearly this time." "I can't read a thing," he muttered, pushing the sheet back across the counter. The tone was sharp, intended to belittle rather than instruct. Harlan nodded without protest, adjusting his glasses and taking the pen again, his movements deliberate, steady, refusing to match the hostility aimed at him. Around them, a few customers shook their heads, lips curling into smirks, whispers spreading like a quiet current of ridicule. Their eyes lingered on the old man's hands, watching his pen scratch across the page as though it were a performance to mock. In the distance, Clive Morrow stood with arms folded, a thin smile tugging at his lips, savoring the scene from behind polished glass. The lobby's hum continued, but the undercurrent of derision was clear patience mistaken for weakness, silence mistaken for surrender. Harlan placed the freshly written form back on the counter, his handwriting still plain but careful. Dustin tilted the page toward the light, squinting as though inspecting each letter under a magnifying glass. His voice rose, carrying farther than necessary. Occupation farmer. The word hung in the air, stretched out with deliberate mockery. A ripple of laughter burst from the counter, spreading quickly among those close enough to hear. Trevor Sloan lifted his phone, zooming in on Harlan's face, eager to capture every crease of age, every flicker of discomfort for his audience. Elaine Mercer stiffened nearby, clutching her child tighter, her eyes narrowing with quiet anger at the cruelty dressed as humor. Harlan stood motionless, his jaw steady, the corners of his mouth neither rising nor falling. He had heard this before countless times, and the sting no longer came from the word itself, but from the eagerness of others to make it a weapon. Marla Keene reached for the form. Next, her gaze sliding from the page to Harlan's worn frame. She leaned toward Dustin, her voice a whisper meant to be heard. Think he even has $10 to his name. Her fingers tapped slowly on the keyboard, every keystroke drawn out as if mocking the weight. Customers in line shifted impatiently, sighs echoing as the pace slowed for the sake of ridicule. One man grumbled, another muttered under his breath, but the tension turned not against the clerks but against Harlan, as though his presence alone disrupted their comfort. Clive Morrow, watching with visible satisfaction, swept his eyes across the lobby. "Enjoy the show," he said with a grin, his tone dripping with arrogance. The laughter of Trevor's live stream merged with the irritation of the crowd, a cruel chorus that painted Harlan as both burden and spectacle. He remained upright, expression calm, bearing the weight without defense. But silence does not erase insult, it only sharpens the edge. Trevor Sloan shoved his phone toward Dustin Hale, the screen glowing with a growing stream of numbers. "Look at these views," he bragged, his grin widening as comments scrolled fast, filled with cheap jokes and ridicule about Harlan's clothes, his age, his presence in a bank. Dustin chuckled, clearing his throat and pretending to read aloud, twisting the comments into sharper insults for the crowd around him. A few bystanders snickered, shaking their heads as if the spectacle was harmless fun. The laughter spread through pixels and whispers, each mocking word stripping away dignity with careless ease. Harlan stood a few feet away, motionless, his gaze steady as hands resting on the worn wallet in his grip. He neither flinched nor reacted, his calmness disarming in the middle of cruelty. Yet Elaine Mercer's eyes flashed with anger as she glanced at Trevor, her expression sharp, protective, silently condemning the mockery. The lobby carried on as if nothing had changed, but the seed of contempt was now broadcast beyond the walls, multiplied by strangers watching through a screen. Clive Morrow left the comfort of his office, each step deliberate, polished shoes striking the floor with authority. The hum of conversation dipped as he crossed the lobby, his presence demanding attention. He stopped near Harlan, voice booming, "Old man, you here to check your balance? I'd bet you don't have a cent." His words, sharp and theatrical, echoed across the hall. Heads turned, curious eyes drawn to the clash. A few chuckles rose, then more, building into a ripple of laughter that filled the marble room. Some customers leaned closer, eager for entertainment, while others shook their heads, unwilling to intervene. Harlan, in the middle of it all, held his silence. His eyes met Clive's with a calm, unwavering steadiness that made the mockery sound almost hollow. The dignity in his quiet stare carried more weight than Clive's arrogance, though the crowd was blind to it. Laughter still rolled through the space, feeding the cruelty like fuel. Marla Keene tapped the keyboard, her nails clicking with irritation as she frowned at the screen. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, just loud enough for customers nearby to hear. "Serving people like this is always trouble." Her tone was soaked with contempt, words designed to sting. Dustin Hale folded his arms beside her, nodding with a smirk, his laugh short and smug. Trevor, never missing a chance, lifted his phone again, angling the lens toward Harlan as though the old man's stillness was comedy worth sharing. The crowd shifted, whispers threading together into an uneasy chorus. Some amused, others impatient, all too willing to accept the belittlement as ordinary. Elaine Mercer turned sharply, her eyes, fierce, fixing Marla with a glare that cut through the haze of mockery. Harlan remained quiet, his figure steady, refusing to rise to the bait. His silence grew heavier, echoing louder than the words meant to crush him. Yet with every insult the tension swelled tighter, pressing against the walls of the room. The line behind Harlan shifted restlessly, impatience spilling into whispered judgments. "Why does the bank even let someone dressed like that stand here?" A man in a sharp vest muttered, tapping his polished shoe against the marble with irritation. His words carried catching the ears of others who nodded, their eyes narrowing at Harlan as if his presence slowed their progress. Trevor Sloan seized the moment, leaning toward Dustin Hale with a grin. "He probably doesn't even have enough to open an account," he said loudly, ensuring others heard. Dustin smothered his laugh with a hand, his shoulders shaking with exaggerated amusement. The sound drew a ripple of chuckles from the restless crowd, their discomfort quickly redirected into ridicule. Through it all, Harlan stood motionless, his shoulders squared, a faint sigh escaping his lips, but nothing more. He bore the insults as if they were old companions, his dignity unshaken, even as contempt pressed in from every side. Each sneer and whisper added weight to the scene-building pressure that could not remain hidden forever. Elaine Mercer rose from her seat, shifting her baby carefully in her arms as she stepped closer to Harlan. Her voice was soft, meant only for him. "Don't let them trouble you, sir." "I know you're good," she whispered, her eyes steady, carrying warmth amidst the cold stares. Harlan's face softened, and he returned her kindness with a small grateful smile, a flicker of light in a room clouded with scorn. Trevor Sloan broke the moment with a sharp whistle, tilting his phone toward them. "Look at that. The old man's got a fan," he jeered, laughter dripping from each word. The remark spread quickly, drawing a wave of snickers from the curious crowd. From across the lobby, Clive Morrow heard and let out a booming laugh, enjoying the humiliation as if it were a performance staged for his amusement. Yet the simple exchange between Elaine and Harlan remained a quiet reminder that kindness could still surface even in a place drowning in arrogance. Dustin Hale waved over a guard with a casual flick of his wrist, his voice laced with suggestion. "Might want to keep an eye on this one," he said, his tone implying trouble without evidence. The guard hesitated, glancing at Harlan, who remained calm, his hands resting on the edge of the counter. Doubt flickered in the guard's eyes, but Clive Morrow's sharp nod settled the matter. Reluctantly, the guard stepped closer, positioning himself near Harlan as though danger lingered in his quiet presence. The message was clear: suspicion had been planted. Elaine Mercer's voice cut through the tension, firm despite the child in her arms. "He hasn't done anything wrong," she protested, her words sparking murmurs across the lobby. The atmosphere shifted, whispers colliding with raised voices, the once orderly room slipping into disorder. Harlan stood still in the storm, bearing the false suspicion without protest, his silence a shield against the injustice pressing in. Yet every accusation tightened the air, readying the moment for something greater to shatter the facade. The printer whirred as Marla Keene pulled a sheet from the tray, her eyes scanning the preliminary account details. Her lips curled into a smirk, not at the figures but at the opportunity they gave her. "Nothing remarkable," she announced loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear exactly what I thought. Her tone dripped with false certainty, a performance staged for ridicule rather than truth. Trevor Sloan immediately angled his phone toward Harlan, zooming close on the deep lines of his face. On his screen, he added a mocking caption, eager to feed the growing audience outside the bank walls. Dustin chuckled beside Marla, shaking his head as though the matter were already decided. Clive Morrow folded his arms across his chest, leaning casually against the counter with the look of a man confident in victory, his smirk wide and unchallenged. The lobby echoed with faint snickers, the weight of collective disdain pressing closer. Harlan stood unflinching, the crumpled wallet still in his grip, as though the tide of contempt couldn't touch him. The moment lingered heavy with expectation, a silence forming before something none of them anticipated would break through. Late at night, the small room glowed under the dim warmth of a single lamp. Harlan sat at a wooden desk, his sleeves-rolled-up eyes focused on neat rows of numbers in a ledger. Each entry recorded with care, every figure exact as though precision itself carried dignity. Coins clinked softly as he counted them into small stacks, his hands moving with calm resolve despite their weariness. A knock sounded at the door, and a factory worker stepped inside, cap in hand, his face lined with fatigue. He laid down a modest payment and extended his hand in gratitude. Harlan clasped it firmly, his voice steady. "We build together." The man's eyes glistened, relief passing across his features before he left. Alone again, Harlan looked down at the ledger, determination reflected in his steady gaze. The lamp's light framed his face, every shadow cut by resolve. This was not wealth for himself, but a foundation for others, one stone at a time. Even in solitude, the work carried a purpose larger than him. Back in the present, Dustin Hale shoved the papers across the counter toward Harlan, his smirk unrelenting. "You're sure you filled this right?" he asked, his tone cutting with sarcasm. "Don't waste our time again." The words landed like another dismissal sharpened for the ears of those watching. Trevor Sloan, seizing the moment, brought his phone close to Dustin's grinning face, capturing the cruelty as entertainment. Behind them, murmurs rippled as other customers raised their own phones, eager to join the spectacle. The air grew thick with a mixture of impatience and mockery, every breath in the room tinged with disdain. Harlan did not flinch. He took the pen, adjusted the form with steady strokes, and signed with deliberate calm. His silence did not deny the humiliation, but carried it without surrender, a quiet defiance sharper than anger. Each line he wrote drew tighter the invisible string of tension the lobby now hushed under its pull. He lifted his head, eyes clear, facing the crowd with the patience of a man who had endured worse. Clive Morrow moved closer, his polished shoes striking the floor with deliberate force. He snatched the paper straight from Dustin's hands, his voice booming across the lobby. "Enough of this. Let me see what this old man actually has." He glanced at the form, eyes catching the shaky letters at the bottom. A sharp laugh erupted from his chest. "Look at this signature straight out of the fields. Pure farmer." His words, cut clean, meant not just for Harlan, but for every ear in the room. Dustin chuckled. Marla smirked, and Trevor lowered his phone just enough to join in the laughter, their derision swelling together. The group's cruelty found its rhythm echoing in the open space until it sounded almost rehearsed. Nearby, Elaine Mercer pulled her child closer, her jaw tightening, her face flushed with anger. She glared at Clive, but her disapproval was drowned out by the roar of mockery. Harlan remained silent, the insult etched into the air, his dignity tested again before an audience eager to see him fall. Marla Keene turned back to her desk, fingers pressing the keys with a hasty rhythm. The glow of the monitor reflected in her eyes, and for the first time that day, her smirk faltered. She blinked rapidly, swallowing hard, and pressed the keys again as though repetition might change what she saw. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm facade she tried to keep. Dustin leaned in curiosity, pushing aside his smugness, but the color drained from his face the instant he caught a glimpse of the figures. His lips parted without sound, the laugh he had ready turning into a hollow pause. Trevor stepped closer, phone angled toward the screen, but Marla shifted instinctively, blocking the view. The crowd remained unaware, buzzing with whispers and giggles, their attention still fixed on the man they mocked. Yet a crack had formed, a small fracture in the performance. Something lay hidden in those numbers, something none of them were ready to confront. The printer hummed again, spitting out a fresh sheet, but Marla's fingers hesitated. She stared at the paper, the words and numbers clear as day, yet she froze, her knuckles whitening around the page. Clive, impatient and dismissive, snatched it from her grasp with a laugh. "What's the hesitation? Let's see the joke in full," he said, shaking his head. But as his eyes dropped to the printed line, the laughter died in his throat. His lips twitched, then stilled, his smirk collapsing into a blank, colorless stare. His hand trembled, the paper rattling faintly as silence fell over him. Dustin's grin vanished. Marla's breath caught, and Trevor lowered his phone slowly, sensing the shift. Around them, customers leaned closer, drawn by the sudden stillness. The air grew thick, the noise of the lobby evaporating into a stunned hush. For the first time, Clive had no words. In the silence, the power of the truth pressed down heavy and undeniable. Clive's eyes locked onto the numbers, widening as though the page had burned him. His breath caught, and the confident smirk he carried all morning drained into disbelief. Dustin leaned over his shoulder for a glimpse, his face paling, as the magnitude sank in, forcing him to step back as if distance could soften the shock. Trevor lowered his phone, the live stream forgot in his mouth, hanging open, unable to shape words. Marla pressed a hand against her lips, fighting to contain the gasp rising in her throat, her body rigid with dread. The figures were too immense, impossible to dismiss as error, impossible to reconcile with the image they had mocked. From the back, Elaine's voice broke the silence, soft yet heavy. "My God." The whisper rippled through the crowd like a sudden draft, turning smirks into stares, laughter into uneasy quiet. The paradox was undeniable. A man ridiculed as worthless now revealed wealth beyond imagination. Harlan reached forward, calm and deliberate, reclaiming the paper from Clive's trembling hands. He folded it neatly, smoothing the creases with care before sliding it into the battered wallet that had carried so little attention until this moment. The movement was unhurried, each gesture measured, as though the noise of the lobby no longer existed. Dozens of eyes followed every detail, drawn not just to the paper, but to the unshaken composure of the man holding it. The silence pressed harder than any insult had before a weight that even Clive could not laugh away. his throat tightened, voice breaking as he stammered, Who are you? The question hung fragile brittle under the strain of fear. Harlan looked up, his expression, calm eyes, steady, the faintest trace of a smile on his face. He gave no answer, only presence, a dignity that required no defense. Sometimes silence delivers more power than words ever could. Elaine stepped closer, her baby resting against her shoulder as she leaned toward Harlan. Her voice was gentle, filled with quiet certainty. I knew you weren't ordinary, she said, her eyes holding gratitude and awe. Around them, whispers spread among the waiting customers, fragments of speculation weaving into a tense hum. The once mocking stares now flickered with curiosity, unease, even respect. Trevor lowered his phone, completely shame burning across his face as he pocketed the device that had fueled ridicule. Dustin shifted backward, his shoulders, hunched eyes fixed on the floor, the bravado drained from his frame. Marla's gaze turned to Clive, searching his face for direction, but what she found was panic barely contained. The atmosphere tilted, the balance of judgment beginning to unravel, arrogance unraveling thread by thread. The crowd that had laughed now watched in silence, waiting for the truth that was no longer so easily hidden. Harlan placed the paper on the counter and with a steady hand signed his name. The pen glided in smooth, deliberate strokes, leaving behind a signature practiced over decades. Clive leaned in, expecting more mockery, but the sight of the familiar script struck him like a blow. His eyes widened, the arrogance slipping from his face as memory rushed in. Hanging in the boardroom upstairs, framed in solemn respect, was the founding contract of the bank, and on it the very same signature. The lines matched perfectly, every curve unmistakable. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead, sliding down his temple as realization sank deeper. He staggered slightly, voice cracking under the weight of fear. No, it can't be. He whispered, though the tremor in his tone betrayed him. Around them, the crowd shifted, sensing the unraveling, sensing something greater than wealth was at play. The quiet dignity of the old man's hand revealed a truth more devastating than numbers. The sudden sound of doors swinging open cut through the silence. From the entrance stepped Victor Langford, flanked by members of the board, their presence commanding the room with gravity. Every employee froze, their chatter dying instantly as posture straightened, heads bowing in respect. The weight of authority pressed into the marble hall, making the air feel heavier. Victor's stride was firm, his gaze fixed not on Clive, not on the staff, but on Harlan West. Without hesitation, he approached and inclined his head with a gesture of reverence. A ripple of shock moved through the lobby like an invisible wave. Clive's jaw slackened, the color draining from his cheeks as he struggled to swallow the lump rising in his throat. Dustin stiffened, his smirk gone, unease settling in his eyes. Trevor lowered his phone, fumbling to shut it off, realizing the spectacle had shifted beyond mockery. The room fell utterly silent, waiting for confirmation of the impossible truth already forming in their minds. Victor's voice rang out deep and deliberate, shattering the silence. "Welcome back, Mr. West." The words struck like thunder, echoing across the lobby. Gasps followed, then hurried whispers threading through the crowd. West, Harlan. West. The name rippled outward, disbelief twisting into awe as recognition settled. The man mocked as a beggar was revealed as the founder himself. Clive stumbled backward, his legs, unsteady, face pale as if the blood had been drained from him. His arrogance, once towering, now crumbled into nothing. Dustin dropped his gaze to the floor, shame smothering his voice, his earlier bravado swallowed whole. Trevor fumbled with his phone, hastily ending the broadcast, his hands shaking with embarrassment. The room, moments earlier filled with laughter, now stood in reverent silence, every eye fixed on Harlan West. His calm presence filled the space with a power no display of wealth could rival. The truth had shattered the facade. Harlan lifted his gaze, letting it travel across the lobby that had moments earlier been filled with jeers. His voice, calm yet unwavering, carried through the space. True worth isn't in a balance sheet. It's in how we treat each other. The words landed with force, silencing every murmur that had lingered. The weight of the message seemed to press on the room, drawing heads down in shame. A man in a suit who had mocked moments earlier shifted uncomfortably, eyes fixed on the floor. Elaine Mercer, holding her child, nodded through the sting of tears, her lips trembling with gratitude. Clive Morrow, who once stood as the loudest voice in mockery, now drew sharp breaths, his face burning red, the confidence stripped away. The silence was no longer hostile but reflective, as though each person in the room had been caught in a mirror they could not escape. A single truth had turned laughter into shame. When arrogance dissolves, what remains is the quiet echo of dignity. Harlan's voice broke the stillness again, but this time it carried memory. I once stood in this very place, poor, turned away. But I chose to build something not for myself alone, but so others could have a chance. His words were not long yet, every syllable cut deep, tethered to the reality of the man they had underestimated. The customers, once eager for entertainment, now leaned in with solemn focus, their faces softened by understanding. Trevor Sloan, who had paraded mockery across the internet, lowered his phone until the screen went black, shame settling heavy on his shoulders. Dustin Hale stepped back, his eyes darting to the ground, unwilling to meet the old man's gaze. Clive's lips pressed together, a thin line of resistance crumbling as sweat streaked down his temple. The story was short, but its weight was immense resilience forged not in comfort, but in rejection. In the silence that followed, the crowd no longer saw an old man. They saw the journey of a builder. Victor Langford gestured quietly toward a clerk, signaling for Harlan's words to be recorded. The young employee nodded, eyes shining as he wiped tears hastily from his cheek. Around the room, the energy shifted. The crowd no longer leaned forward with curiosity, but with reverence. Elaine whispered a soft, trembling thank you, her voice breaking as she clutched her child closer. The sentiment echoed unspoken among others who found themselves moved beyond explanation. Clive Morrow stood rigid, his head bowed, unable to lift his eyes toward the man he had despised only moments before. His silence screamed louder than apology, his shame laid bare. The entire hall seemed to pause, time stretching as the weight of one man's integrity pressed down on all who watched. The laughter that once filled the air was gone, replaced by stillness heavy with reflection. In that moment, the bank no longer felt like a place of transactions, but a place of reckoning. Harlan turned slowly, his steps measured as he began to walk toward the exit. Each footfall echoed against the marble, loud in the silence that had swallowed the room. The sound carried weight, a rhythm that marked the close of arrogance and the beginning of reflection. Clive Morrow lifted his hand-mouth, parting as though to speak, but no words emerged. His throat tightened, caught between apology and fear, leaving him frozen in shame. Dustin Hale stood motionless, breath shallow, as if afraid even to exhale. Around them, customers and employees alike remained still, eyes locked on the solitary figure moving away from the center of humiliation he had so calmly overturned. No one laughed, no one whispered. The silence was deeper than noise, filled with reverence and unease. The image of the old man, steady and dignified, seared itself into their memory. Some moments end with applause, others with silence heavier than thunder. Near the door, Harlan paused, turning back one final time. His voice calm but firm, cut through the hush. "I built this bank so people could dream, not so they could be scorned." The words resonated in the marble hall, striking deeper than any reprimand. In the crowd, an elderly man nodded, eyes glistening as though the sentence had reached something buried within him. Elaine Mercer clutched her child, tears sliding freely down her cheeks, her heart heavy with gratitude. Trevor Sloan lowered his gaze, shame burning hot against his skin, as he slipped his phone into his pocket without a word. No jeers followed, no whispers of dissent. Instead, the silence held a different weight now, one of recognition of a truth they could no longer ignore. His final message lingered, floating above the hush like a vow etched into stone. Harlan stepped beyond the doors, the golden wash of the late afternoon light spilling over his shoulders. The fading sun painted his worn jacket in shades of amber, his slow stride framed by brilliance that seemed to honor his leaving. Inside, through the glass, employees and customers remained fixed on the sight, their expressions transformed. Some pressed hands to their chests, humbled by the weight of what they had witnessed. Others simply stared as though afraid that looking away would break the moment. The lobby, once thick with mockery and arrogance, now felt cleansed, its atmosphere altered beyond recognition. No one dared laugh, no one dared move until his figure blended into the brightness outside. He carried no grandeur, no fanfare, only the quiet authority of humility. The image etched itself into every witness, a man who had revealed the difference between pride and dignity. Days later, the boardroom was heavy with silence as Clive sat stiffly before Victor Langford and the directors. His hands trembled against the polished table, eyes clouded with fear and shame. The door opened and Harlan entered in a plain suit, carrying none of the grandeur others might expect. Clive's gaze dropped instantly, unable to meet his eyes. Harlan's voice was calm but unyielding. "Leadership is not measured by power. It is measured by kindness." The words turned the air cold, striking harder than any formal reprimand. Justice had arrived not with fury, but with undeniable truth. Clive's shoulders sagged as he bowed his head, voice breaking. "I resign." The admission carried both surrender and relief. Victor gave a solemn nod, accepting without hesitation. Harlan did not gloat, nor did he scold. Instead, he spoke softly, words like a lifeline. "You still have the chance to do what's right, if you choose to take it." The room fell still, every member of the board absorbing the weight of mercy. Tears welled in Clive's eyes as he rose, leaving in silence the echo of his footsteps, a reminder of humility learned too late. Harlan's eyes turned to the window, the city glowing beneath the afternoon sun. A quiet smile touched his face as he spoke with conviction. Wealth was never the goal. Dignity is. Victor nodded, the truth settling over the room like iron. Outside, the skyline blazed with light, a reminder that every life carries value beyond appearances. And now it is your turn. If you have ever been judged unfairly, let your voice be heard. Write it below, "I've been there too." Share this story. Remind the world, respect is not optional. It is the real measure of worth.